The cedar closet wasn't supposed to hold any secrets anymore. 3 days after my wife's funeral, my granddaughter was helping me sort through blankets we had packed away years earlier when she slid the small wooden door open and froze without saying a word. Resting alone on the top shelf was a perfectly folded American flag. Beside it lay a weathered envelope sealed with yellowed tape, its edges softened by 40 years of waiting. She looked at the handwriting first. Then she looked at me. "Grandpa," she asked quietly, "who's Thomas Callahan?" For a moment I forgot how to breathe. If you've ever wondered how long a promise can survive in silence, I hope you'll stay with me. Emily had grown up believing she knew every meaningful story our family carried. She knew about my years in the Marine Corps. She knew about the little house her grandmother and I had built after I came home. She knew why I stood silently every Memorial Day with a cup of black coffee before sunrise. She knew almost everything. Just not this. I walked slowly across the bedroom and gently closed the cedar closet. "That's something we don't need to talk about." She frowned, not with frustration, but with concern. "You've kept that flag hidden my entire life." "I know. And Grandma never mentioned it." "I know." She rested one hand against the closet door. "Did it belong to someone you served with?" I looked away before answering. "It belonged to someone who trusted me." That was all I could manage. Emily nodded respectfully. She had inherited her grandmother's patience. "I'm not trying to pry. I know. I've just never seen you afraid of a question before." Neither had I. Outside, autumn rain tapped softly against the porch roof while the quiet house settled around us. Everywhere I looked, I still expected to see my wife's favorite chair, her reading glasses, or the knitting basket she always left beside the fireplace. Instead, there was only silence. Emily carefully returned the folded blanket to the shelf below the flag. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For what?" "For asking if it hurts." I smiled faintly. Some promises are supposed to. She didn't ask another question. Instead, she helped me finish organizing the bedroom before driving home that evening. I believed the conversation had ended. I was wrong. The following morning, while carrying groceries into the kitchen, I noticed one book missing from the family bookshelf. It was our old Marine Corps unit history. Emily had borrowed it dozens of times growing up. This time, however, I remembered something tucked inside its back cover. 40 years earlier, I had slipped an old photograph between its final pages. A photograph of 2 young Marines standing shoulder to shoulder. One was me. The other was Thomas Callahan. I drove to Emily's apartment before I had fully convinced myself to leave the driveway. When she opened the door, the unit history already rested on her dining table. The photograph lay beside it. She looked up gently. "You said the flag belonged to someone who trusted you." I nodded. She picked up the faded photograph. "Then why does it look like he trusted you with his entire life?" For the first time in 40 years, I realized the promise I had protected inside a cedar closet had finally found its way into someone else's hands. Emily didn't touch the photograph again after I asked for it back. Instead, she poured 2 cups of coffee and waited until I sat across from her kitchen table. It was the same kind of patience her grandmother had carried throughout our 52 years together. Neither woman believed silence had to be defeated. Sometimes it only needed company. I won't force you to tell me anything, Emily said quietly. I know. But I also know that Grandma spent her whole life protecting something she didn't completely understand. That sentence settled heavily between us. I looked toward the apartment window. Your grandmother understood more than you think. Emily blinked. She knew about the flag? She knew it existed. The letter too? I nodded once. She never opened either one. Did she ask? Only once. I smiled to myself. Then she told me she'd wait until I was ready. Emily looked down at the photograph resting on the table. Two young Marines stood shoulder to shoulder beneath a faded American flag outside a communications building. Thomas was smiling broadly. I wasn't. You don't look happy. I had just lost a chess game. She laughed softly. Seriously? Thomas cheated. I doubt that. So did I. For the first time since the funeral, I heard myself laugh. It surprised both of us. Emily carefully turned the photograph over. On the back, written in fading blue ink, were only 6 words. Brothers by choice, Marines by duty. She traced the handwriting gently. Thomas wrote this? He always signed photographs. But never letters? He believed letters should speak for themselves. Something about that answer made her thoughtful. She stood and walked toward the bookshelf. Can I ask one more question? You already have. She smiled. Did the flag belong to Thomas? I closed my eyes briefly. Yes. Then why wasn't it buried with him? I looked at the folded photograph before answering. Because it wasn't given to his family. Her expression changed. It was given to you. No. I slowly shook my head. It was entrusted to me. There was a difference. Emily sensed it immediately. She didn't ask another question. Instead, she reached into the Marine Corps history book and carefully removed a second item I had forgotten was tucked between the pages. A faded newspaper clipping. The headline read, Local Marine honored after training accident. There was no mention of combat. No medals. No public ceremony. Only a photograph of Thomas in dress blues, standing beside several Marines whose faces had blurred with age. Emily looked closer. You're not in this picture. I wasn't there that day. But this happened while you served together. Yes. She frowned. Then why would you keep an article about something you never witnessed? I answered without thinking. Because it reminded me of the kind of man he already was. She folded the clipping carefully. You've never spoken about him before. I promised myself I wouldn't. Why? Because every time I almost did. My voice faded. It wasn't my story to tell. Emily nodded slowly. I think I'm beginning to understand. I hope not. She looked surprised. Why would you say that? Because understanding this promise means someone else eventually has to carry part of it. The room became very quiet. A few minutes later, Emily gathered the photograph, the newspaper clipping, and the unit history into one careful stack. I'm an archivist, she said gently. Research is literally my job. I know. I also know when someone leaves clues without realizing it. My heart sank. The article gives a year. I remained silent. The photograph gives a unit. Still silent. and the envelope gives Thomas's full name. She looked at me kindly. I'm not searching because I'm curious anymore. She rested her hand over mine. I'm searching because I think you've been carrying this alone for far too long. That evening, after she left, I unlocked the cedar closet once again. For the first time in 40 years, I noticed something tucked beneath the folded flag. It wasn't the unopened letter. It was my wife's handwriting. A small envelope simply read, "For Daniel, when you're finally ready to let someone help." I carried my wife's envelope into the living room before opening it. For several minutes, I simply turned it over in my hands, tracing the familiar handwriting with my thumb. After 52 years of marriage, I could recognize Margaret's penmanship from across a room. Somehow, that made breaking the seal feel like saying goodbye all over again. Inside was only a single folded page. "Daniel," she had written, "if you're reading this, then Emily has found the cedar closet. I always believed she would. She inherited your patience and my curiosity, which makes her the safest person I know to carry a difficult truth." I stopped reading. Emily had been right. Margaret hadn't simply known about the flag. She had understood far more than I ever realized. The next afternoon, Emily met me at the house carrying a notebook instead of questions. "I thought we could organize what we know," she said gently. "I thought you were investigating." "I am." She smiled. "But archives begin with facts." She drew 3 careful columns. What we know, what we assume, what we still don't understand. It reminded me of Marine Corps planning in the simplest possible way. Disciplined, patient, respectful. She wrote the first facts aloud. "Thomas Callahan." I nodded. "United States Marine Corps." "Yes." "The folded flag belonged to him." "Yes." "The unopened letter is addressed to someone else." "It is." She looked up. "You've never actually said who." "I can't." "Because of the promise?" "Because it isn't my name to reveal." She accepted that answer without argument. Instead, she opened her laptop. "As an archivist, I can search public military memorial records." I almost told her to stop. Instead, I remained silent. Some part of me knew the promise had already begun moving forward. After nearly an hour, Emily leaned closer to the screen. "I found him." My heartbeat slowed. "Thomas Callahan, Marine Corps communications specialist, died during a stateside training accident 40 years ago." She looked confused. "That's all there is." "It should be. No surviving spouse listed." I quietly nodded. "No children." Another nod. "But," she whispered. "What?" "There's a surviving younger brother." I closed my eyes. Emily read the name softly. "Thomas Callahan, Jr." I opened my eyes again. "Actually," she looked at me. "The older brother was Thomas. The younger brother's name is Michael." The correction escaped my mouth before I realized what I had done. Emily didn't smile. She simply wrote another note. "Grandpa still remembers." That frightened me more than any question. She searched again. "I found Michael Callahan." My hands tightened around my coffee cup. He still lives in Pennsylvania. Silence filled the room. Emily hesitated before asking her next question. Have you been checking on him? I answered honestly. From a distance. For 40 years? I promised someone I would. But you've never spoken to him? No. Never mailed the letter? No. Never delivered the flag? No. She leaned back thoughtfully. Then this wasn't about hiding. I looked at her. It was about waiting. Before I could answer, someone knocked gently on the front door. Pastor Samuel Brooks stood outside holding a worn leather Bible. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all. He stepped inside, his eyes immediately finding the opened envelope in my hands. Margaret had asked him to come. I realized that before he spoke a single word. I visited her 2 weeks before she passed, he said quietly. She made me promise something. Emily looked between us. What promise? The pastor smiled gently. She asked me to help Daniel understand that keeping a promise and finishing a promise are sometimes two different things. The room fell completely silent. He looked directly at me. I think the time for protecting the letter may finally be ending. I lowered my eyes. For 40 years, I had believed opening the future meant breaking my word. Now, for the first time, I wondered if refusing to move forward had become the only way I could fail it. Then Emily's phone chimed softly. She looked down at the screen. I just received a reply. From who? She swallowed. Michael Callahan answered my message. He hadn't known why she was writing, but he had agreed to meet. Michael Callahan suggested we meet at a small family diner halfway between our two towns. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask how Emily had found him. He simply wrote, "If this has anything to do with my brother Thomas, I'll be there." The message sat on my kitchen table all night. I must have read it 20 times. By morning, I still hadn't decided whether I was brave enough to go. Emily arrived just after sunrise. She carried no folders, no laptop, only 2 travel mugs filled with coffee. I thought you might need company. I thought you might need convincing. She smiled. I stopped trying to convince Marines a long time ago. Pastor Brooks met us in the driveway. He quietly placed one hand on my shoulder. Daniel. I looked at him. Keeping a promise doesn't always mean carrying it alone. An hour later, we were driving north through rolling autumn hills. The cedar box rested carefully on the back seat. Inside were the folded American flag, Thomas's sealed letter, the faded photograph, and Margaret's final note. None of us spoke very much. Some journeys deserve silence. When we reached the diner, Michael was already waiting in a corner booth. He stood as we approached. For a moment, I forgot we were strangers. His eyes looked almost exactly like Thomas's. The same calm expression, the same patient posture, only older. He extended his hand. I'm Michael. I shook it. I'm Daniel Harper. His gaze immediately settled on the cedar box. You brought him with you. The words caught me by surprise. You still talk about Thomas in the present tense? Michael smiled sadly. I never stopped being his little brother. Emily quietly slid into the booth without interrupting. Coffee arrived. No one touched it. Finally, Michael broke the silence. I've spent 40 years wondering whether my brother hated me. I looked up sharply. What makes you believe that? He stopped writing. I lowered my eyes. He couldn't. Michael looked confused. I received one letter after another while he was overseas. I know. Then suddenly, his voice weakened. Nothing. I slowly reached into the cedar box and removed the faded photograph. Thomas smiled back at all of us from another lifetime. He carried this everywhere. Michael picked it up with trembling hands. I've never seen this picture. He wouldn't let anyone borrow it. A faint smile appeared through Michael's tears. That sounds like him. Emily quietly placed Margaret's unopened note beside my coffee cup. Not Thomas's letter. Not yet. Pastor Brooks looked towards Romeo. This part belongs to you. I nodded. 40 years of silence suddenly felt impossibly heavy. When Thomas died, I began quietly, I was with him. Michael stopped breathing for just a moment. He wasn't alone? No. He knew someone stayed? Yes. Tears slowly rolled down Michael's face. My mother always wondered. So did mine. I reached into the cedar box once more. This time I lifted the perfectly folded American flag. Michael stared at it without speaking. I've seen folded flags before. This one isn't mine. I know. You were supposed to receive it. His hands began shaking. I never did. No. Why? The diner disappeared around me. 40 years collapsed into a single memory. Because Thomas asked me not to deliver it. I paused, until I knew his little brother had become the honorable man he always believed you could be. Silence settled over the booth. No dishes clattered. No conversations seemed to exist beyond our table. Michael looked at me with complete disbelief. He said that? He made me promise. But 40 years, I watched. You watched me? From a respectful distance. Michael leaned back slowly. I thought everyone had forgotten him. I gently shook my head. One Marine never could. Before anyone spoke again, Michael reached into his wallet. From behind an old driver's license, he removed a worn newspaper clipping. It was Thomas's obituary. Folded so many times the paper had nearly fallen apart. I've carried this every day since the funeral, he whispered. I only wish he'd known I finally became the brother he deserved. I looked at the unopened envelope still resting inside the cedar box. For the first time in 40 years, I believed Thomas might have known all along. But only the letter could tell us for certain. The unopened envelope rested between Michael and me like a bridge neither of us quite knew how to cross. For 40 years it had remained sealed, not because no one cared, because one Marine had trusted another to wait until the right moment. Michael looked at the envelope for a long time before finally speaking. I don't know if I'm ready. I nodded. Neither do I. Emily gently slid the cedar box closer. No one says it has to be opened today. Pastor Brooks smiled softly. Sometimes courage isn't opening the letter. He looked at Michael. Sometimes it's accepting that someone believed in you before you believed in yourself. Those words lingered over the table. Michael slowly rested his fingertips on the envelope but didn't break the seal. I need to tell you something first. I waited. When Thomas enlisted, He looked toward the diner window. I was angry. I know. I thought he abandoned the family. His voice grew quieter. I said things no brother should ever say. No one interrupted. When he came home on leave, I refused to see him. He closed his eyes. 2 weeks later, he was gone. Emily lowered her head. I spent years blaming myself. Michael reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded another worn piece of paper. It wasn't military paperwork. It was a graduation program. My daughter became the first person in our family to finish college. He smiled through tears. I almost skipped the ceremony because I didn't think I deserved to celebrate anything. What changed? Emily asked. He laughed softly. I imagined what Thomas would have said. He carefully folded the program again. So I went. I looked at him for a long moment. That was exactly the kind of man Thomas had always believed his younger brother could become. I quietly opened the cedar box and removed the folded American flag. I've waited 40 years for this moment. My hands trembled, not because the flag was heavy, because the promise was. I watched from a distance, I admitted. I saw you quit drinking. Michael looked down. I saw you volunteer with the youth center. He blinked. I saw you care for your mother until the day she passed. His eyes filled with tears. I saw your grandchildren run toward you instead of away. The diner disappeared around us. I never judged you by the worst years of your life. I gently placed the folded flag into his hands. I judged you the way Thomas asked me to. Michael held the flag as though it might disappear. I don't deserve this. I smiled faintly. Neither did I. Silence settled between us. Not awkward. Peaceful. Emily finally spoke. Grandpa. I looked toward her. Your memory. I understood immediately. Over the past year, I had begun forgetting small things. Names, appointments, where I left my reading glasses, nothing frightening yet, but enough to remind me that time had become precious. I almost waited too long. Pastor Brooks quietly nodded. Margaret knew. I looked at him. She wrote to me before she died. He smiled. She asked me to remind you that promises are completed by faith, not by perfect timing. Michael carefully lifted the sealed envelope again. If Thomas wanted me to open this, he paused. I'd rather do it with you sitting here. I swallowed hard. I'd like that. Just then, Emily noticed something tucked beneath the velvet lining inside the cedar box. A small leather notebook. I stared at it in confusion. I've never seen that before. Pastor Brooks smiled knowingly. Margaret hid it there. Emily opened the first page. Every Memorial Day for 39 years, Margaret had written a single private journal entry. Not about grief, not about sacrifice, about hope. Each entry ended with exactly the same sentence. Daniel still believes Thomas's promise will find its way home. Michael slowly wiped his eyes. She carried this promise too. I looked toward the empty space where the flag had rested for 4 decades. For the first time since Thomas entrusted it to me, the cedar box no longer felt like a burden. It felt like something finally becoming light. Then Emily carefully turned the unopened envelope over. Across the back, beneath the faded seal, Thomas had written one final sentence none of us had ever noticed. "Open this only when my brother smiles without regret." Michael held the unopened envelope with both hands, studying every crease and faded mark, as though he were trying to recognize his brother's touch through the paper alone. No one urged him to break the seal. 40 years of waiting deserved a few more quiet minutes. The waitress refreshed our coffee without asking questions. She seemed to sense that whatever was happening in the corner booth belonged to another kind of time. Finally, Michael looked at me. Would Thomas be disappointed that it took this long? I answered honestly. I've asked myself that every Memorial Day for 40 years. And? I don't think he measured promises with calendars. Michael slowly nodded. He measured people. I smiled. Exactly. Pastor Brooks rested both hands around his coffee mug. I've spent most of my life watching families try to repair broken relationships after funerals. He looked toward Michael. Very few receive a second opportunity. Emily quietly removed Margaret's journal from the cedar box. I think Grandma knew this day would come. She opened to the final page. Unlike every earlier entry, the last one contained more than a single sentence. If Daniel finally delivers Thomas's promise, tell him I never believed he was hiding from the past. I believed he was protecting someone else's future. I lowered my eyes. Margaret had understood me better than I had understood myself. Michael smiled gently. She sounds remarkable. She was. Silence settled over us again. Then Michael carefully broke the 40-year-old seal. The paper inside unfolded with surprising ease. Thomas's handwriting remained steady and unmistakable. Michael looked toward me. I don't think I can read this out loud. You don't have to. He took a slow breath. Then he began. Dear Michael. His voice cracked almost immediately. He stopped. Emily quietly reached across the table and rested one hand over his. After another deep breath, he continued. If you're reading this, then Daniel finally decided you've become the man I always believed you could be. Michael covered his mouth. Tears slipped silently down his face. I never wanted my last words to arrive while either of us was still angry. The diner seemed impossibly still. You were never fighting me. You were fighting the version of yourself you were afraid would never be enough. Michael closed his eyes. For years he had believed his brother died disappointed. Instead, Thomas had understood him completely. He continued reading. Don't spend your life trying to deserve forgiveness. Spend it becoming the kind of man who freely gives it. Pastor Brooks quietly whispered, Amen. Michael smiled through tears before continuing again. The folded flag belongs to you now. Not because we're brothers by blood. Because every family deserves someone willing to begin again. He stopped reading. No one spoke. No one needed to. The final page contained only one sentence. Daniel kept his promise. Michael slowly folded the letter exactly the way Thomas had folded it decades earlier. Then he looked directly at me. No. I frowned. You kept far more than that. Before I could answer, Emily noticed me rubbing my forehead. You all right? I smiled. Just tired. But that wasn't entirely true. Lately, memories sometimes arrived out of order. Names occasionally disappeared before returning a few minutes later. I had hidden it from almost everyone. Margaret had noticed first. Then Pastor Brooks. Now Emily. She quietly understood without forcing me to explain. "We came in time," she whispered. I nodded. Yes. Michael carefully placed the letter back inside the cedar box beside Margaret's journal. Then he gently shook his head. No. He reached back into the box. The journal belongs with your family. He lifted only two things: the folded American flag and Thomas's letter. Everything else stayed. "I'll carry my brother home," he said softly. "But your family deserves to remember the people who helped him get there." As we stood to leave, Michael stopped beside me. "I've spent 40 years wondering whether Thomas ever stopped loving me." He looked at the folded flag in his hands. "Now I realize." His voice nearly disappeared. He spent his last days making sure I would never doubt it again. Outside the diner, autumn leaves drifted quietly across the parking lot. For the first time in decades, the cedar box felt almost empty. Not because something precious had been taken away, because something precious had finally reached where it had always belonged. The following Saturday, both families gathered in the small community chapel where Margaret and I had renewed our wedding vows 25 years earlier. No reporters waited outside. No military band rehearsed in the parking lot. No public ceremony had been planned. That felt right. Thomas had never cared about attention. Neither had I. The cedar box rested on a simple oak table near the front of the chapel. It no longer held the folded American flag or the sealed letter. Instead, it contained the faded photograph, Margaret's journal, the old newspaper clipping, and 40 years of quiet memories that had somehow become lighter simply because they were finally shared. Emily arranged framed copies of the photograph on a nearby table. One remained with our family. The original belonged to Michael now. As guests quietly found their seats, I watched children from both families begin talking with one another, as though they had known each other for years. That alone felt like part of Thomas's gift. Michael walked toward me carrying the folded flag with both hands. "I'd like you to do something." "What?" "Walk beside me." "Where?" "To my brother." A short distance behind the chapel stood a peaceful memorial garden. Thomas's name appeared on a simple granite marker beneath a young maple tree planted decades earlier by his parents. No elaborate monument, just a name, a date, and a life honestly remembered. Michael stopped in front of the stone. "So this is where he waited." I gently shook my head. "No. He never waited here." Michael looked at me. "He waited in every choice you made after he was gone." Those words settled over us like the autumn sunlight filtering through the trees. Without another word, Michael knelt carefully and placed the folded American flag beneath the maple. Not as something abandoned, as something finally brought home. Pastor Brooks quietly read a short passage about faithfulness. Then he closed the Bible. "I've presided over many funerals," he said softly. "But today isn't about death." He looked toward both families. "It's about a promise that refused to die." Emily stepped forward carrying Margaret's journal. "I'd like to read the final sentence she ever wrote." No one objected. Her voice remained calm. The world remembers heroes for what they accomplish. Families remember them for the promises they keep. Silence followed. Not empty silence. Peaceful silence. Michael looked toward me. My brother chose the right man. I smiled. He chose the patient one. He laughed quietly. Same thing. For the first time in many months, I realized my mind felt unusually clear. The fog that had frightened me seemed to lift, if only for a little while. Perhaps memory sometimes waits for unfinished work to end before allowing itself to rest. Later that afternoon, Emily handed me a small wooden frame. Inside was a copy of the photograph. On the back she had written only one sentence. Brothers by choice, families by promise. I held it for a long moment. You've changed it. She smiled. I think Thomas would approve. As everyone prepared to leave, Michael quietly placed one hand on my shoulder. If my brother could speak today, he paused, I think he'd tell you to stop carrying him. I looked toward the maple tree where the folded flag now rested with quiet dignity. I think he just did. The cedar box came home with me one final time. That evening, I opened the closet where it had spent 40 years hidden from the world. For a long moment I stood in silence. Then I carried the empty cedar box downstairs and placed it beside Margaret's favorite reading chair. It no longer belonged behind a closed door. Its purpose had been fulfilled. Some promises are meant to be guarded. Others are meant to be completed. And the rarest ones become part of every life they quietly touch. The first Memorial Day after Thomas's promise was fulfilled arrived with clear skies and a quiet breeze. For the first time in 40 years, I did not unlock the cedar closet before sunrise. There was no folded flag waiting inside, no sealed letter asking for another year of patience. Only the familiar scent of cedar wood and the peaceful certainty that nothing important had been forgotten. The closet was finally empty, and somehow, so was the burden I had carried for nearly half my life. Emily stopped by that morning carrying breakfast from the little bakery Margaret had always loved. She smiled when she noticed the closet door standing open. You left it open. I thought it deserved fresh air. She laughed softly. So did Grandma. We shared breakfast at the kitchen table where Margaret and I had spent thousands of ordinary mornings together. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Not because there was nothing left to say. Because peace rarely asks for conversation. A few weeks later, Emily invited me to the local historical society. I have something to show you. Inside one quiet gallery stood a modest display titled Promises That Outlive Us. There were no medals displayed beneath bright lights, no dramatic battlefield photographs, no oversized headlines. Instead, visitors found copies of Thomas's photograph, a carefully written summary of two Marines who kept faith with one another, and Margaret's final sentence displayed beneath the exhibit. Families remember people for the promises they keep. The original letter remained with Michael's family. The original folded flag rested where it belonged. Only the story had been shared. I looked toward Emily. You didn't make it about me. She smiled. It never was. Pastor Brooks quietly joined us. You know, he said, children have been stopping here all week. Really? They keep asking the same question. What question? He smiled. They want to know whether promises really can last 40 years. I looked once more at the old photograph. I hope someone tells them they're asking the wrong question. Emily tilted her head. What should they ask instead? I smiled. They should ask whether they're willing to keep one. That afternoon, Michael called. He didn't have news. He didn't need advice. He simply wanted to tell me he had placed Thomas's letter inside a family Bible where future generations would one day read it together. Not as a story about loss. As a story about becoming the person someone already believed you could be. After we hung up, I stepped onto the front porch with Margaret's journal resting quietly beside me. The evening sun settled across the old maple tree in the yard. For the first time in many years, I realized I wasn't waiting for another Memorial Day. I was simply grateful to have reached this one. If this story reminded you that the strongest promises are often the quietest ones, I hope you'll carry that thought into your own life. Sometimes the greatest legacy is not a medal, a title, or public recognition. Sometimes it is the patient decision to keep your word when no one else is watching. Thank you for sharing this journey. May God bless you, and may every promise built on honor, kindness, and integrity find its way home before it is too late.